Hello everyone, Professor Kurzlock here. So I wanted to make a video connecting protest movements, civil disobedience, and political change in the United States. So when we study contentious politics in democracies, which does look different than when we study contentious politics in authoritarian regimes. But for now, when we study contentious politics in democracies, few things illustrate the relationship between citizens and power more clearly than protest movements. Protests are not merely spontaneous crowds or bursts of emotion. They are ways that ordinary people can collectively articulate their grievances, can challenge authority, can assert rights, and push for political change and push for public policy change. Really, a way for people to show that they have some power in the American political system. So in this lecture and this discussion, we're going to weave together some of the assigned readings and broader historical examples to understand how protest movements have shaped American politics. From our reading on Martin Luther King Jr., his letter from Birmingham Jail, to student activism and broader waves of civil protest. So let's begin in 1963 with MLK's letter from Birmingham Jail. King wrote this relatively, and I think, short but dense, but relatively easy to read and understand. This pretty powerful document while in prison for participating in nonviolent demonstrations against segregation in Birmingham, Alabama. Local clergy had criticized his tactics as unwise and untimely. And King responded, not just to justify the protest, to justify his actions, but to articulate the moral and strategic logic of civil disobedience. He wrote that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere, highlighting this interconnectedness of struggle and why waiting for courts and slow legal remedies oftentimes fails those who are oppressed or those who do not have access to the levers of power. King outlines what nonviolent direct action is. Researchers describe stages such as collecting facts, negotiating, self purification, and direct action itself, designed to create constructive tension that forces a community to confront deeply rooted injustices. Nonviolence isn't just passive. It's a deliberate strategy that exposes moral contradictions in society and aims to shift both public opinion and institutional responses. King's commitment to nonviolence and his insistence that oppressed people cannot simply wait for justice remains the cornerstone of democratic protest theory. The letter from Birmingham Jail gives us a window into how protests can frame issues and claim legitimacy for action that official institutions resist. It also highlights a key tension in democratic politics. When formal channels seem blocked or inattainable to average citizens, citizens often turn to collective action as an alternative avenue for influence. This strategy has deep roots in American protest history. From the suffrage parades and labor demonstrations in the early 20th century to mass marches like the 1963 March in Washington, where an interracial crowd rallied for jobs and civil rights, and where King delivered his iconic I Have a Dream speech. Protest has been central to expanding democratic participation. That march helped build momentum towards the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Two landmark pieces of legislation that reshaped American society. But protest movements are not only about landmark national protests. They happen across time and they vary in their scale and size and reflect broader societal currents. For instance, the 1971 May Day protests against the Vietnam War involved tens of thousands of people in Washington, D.C., and resulted in mass arrests. At that time, the largest in U.S. history. These demonstrations highlighted citizen opposition to a prolonged war and helped shape and shifted public opinion over time. Fast forward to the 21st century, student activism has again emerged as a powerful force for agenda setting or for societal change. After the 2018 Parkland school shooting, thousands of students engaged in protests such as the National School Walkout and the broader March for Our Lives movement, calling for stronger gun laws and just demanding safer schools. These efforts mobilized young people across thousands of schools in, excuse me, and reshaped national conversations around gun violence and civic engagement. Student activism, however, is not new. In 1968, for example, students at Columbia University occupied campus buildings to protest both the Vietnam War and perceived racial injustices. This episode helped connect anti-war sentiment with broader critiques of institutional racism, power structures, and showed how youth protests can catalyze and build towards larger movements. Another contemporary angle is the growth of civil unrest and political violence indicators in recent years. Data compiled by analysts, by political scientists and data analysts, show that the frequency of reported civil unrest events in the U.S. has grown over the last decade, reflecting heightened political polarization and social tension even within a democracy. These trends include everything from large peaceful demonstrations to moments of intensified conflict, such as January 6, 2001, the attack on the U.S. Capitol, which, while distinct from traditional protest movements, underscore the volatility of modern political mobilization. And as we talked about in class, when we think about protest movements, we can think of protest movements as being positive, but they can also be negative. Some of our readings showed the Ku Klux Klan rallies, or January 6th, where where a rally turns into something that maybe it didn't intend to be, or maybe the cause was bad. It was Klan rallies in Washington, D.C. are a troublesome part of American history. So one of the key threads that ties these varied episodes together is how protest movements interact with civil liberties, particularly the First Amendment. We started off two of our classes thinking about where the right to demonstrate and march and air grievances comes from. In the American political tradition, freedoms of speech and assembly and petition are foundational. Citizens have the constitutional rights to peacefully assemble and to present grievances to governments. Rights that make protests not just social behavior, but a democratic institution in its own right. Cases involving protest often involve debates about how these rights are balanced with public order, police responses, and political expression. Protests shape public policy and political culture in several interconnected ways. First, they shift public opinion. Sustained visibility of a cause makes the issue salient to a broader society and can lead to a realignment of voters and issue priorities. We talked about in class the emergence of social media as a way to share images and ideas in meeting places. Changing media landscape has shaped how we think about and talk about, organize, or participate in protest movements. So second, protests can signal political strength and urgency to elected officials. When large numbers of people take to the streets, politicians can recognize that ignoring that issue carries enormous political risks. The student protests around gun violence, for instance, led to increased voter registration efforts and pushed gun safety into electoral debates. What started out as protests shaped electoral politics because elected officials saw this as either a winning or, if they didn't act, a losing proposition to at least think about and talk about. Third, protests oftentimes build networks and organizations that endure beyond that single protest event. Civil rights groups, labor unions, youth coalitions, and community organizations, community organizational infrastructure, all use these protest movements and then, sorry, that's my dog in the background, and then leverage that organizational infrastructure to pursue policy change through lobbying, litigation, and electoral participation. Finally, protests influence public policy through normative framing. Movements help define what is considered legitimate political discourse. For instance, by insisting morally and practically that certain injustices cannot be ignored. Protest movements expand the boundaries of acceptable political debate. Over time, this can lead to cultural and legal reforms that once seemed unthinkable. At the same time, protest movements are not without challenges or even critics. Authorities often respond with pressure or repression, maybe legal restrictions, and movements themselves can fragment or be co-opted. Mass mobilization does not automatically translate to legislative victories or even to new legislation. And sometimes the distance between protest and policy is long and contested. Even so, what binds these examples together, from King's nonviolent campaigns to Parkland students' walkouts, from the 1960s anti-war activism to contemporary civil unrest metrics, is the simple fact that people in large numbers acting collectively does matter for changes in society. Protest movements are not marginal episodes in American history. They are central to how power is contested, how norms evolve, and how societies negotiate conflict and change. When we look at this history, we see that protest is not merely noise at the edges of politics. It's a core mechanism by which democracy and justice is contested, articulated, and over time sometimes realized. Thank you.